The air inside the county courtroom was thick, smelling faintly of lemon wax and decades of resentment. Elias Thorne sat at the defendant's table, his hands, calloused, gnarled, and stained with the permanent ink of a life spent in the dirt, clutched tightly around a weathered leather briefcase. He wore his only suit, a charcoal gray relic from the 1970s that hung off his thin frame like a costume. Across the aisle, Sheriff Miller leaned back in his chair, his uniform starched to a blinding, aggressive white. He was a man who wore his authority like a weapon, his eyes scanning the room with the practiced arrogance of someone who had never been told no. The case was supposed to be a formality. A simple eminent domain dispute over a 3-acre plot that the county wanted for a new highway bypass. It was small, it was trivial, and it was, in the eyes of Sheriff Miller, entirely beneath him. But the sheriff had taken a personal interest in this project, and he had made it his business to ensure that the stubborn old fool on the back road was cleared out quickly. Miller shifted his weight, his holster creaking against the wooden chair, and let out a scoff that echoed through the quiet chamber. He leaned toward his deputy, whispering something that ended in a sharp, dismissive laugh. It was a sound designed to belittle, a sound meant to remind everyone present that Elias Thorne was nothing more than a nuisance to be swatted away. Elias didn't look up. He didn't react. He simply stared at the judge's bench, his expression as unreadable as the back of a shovel. To the observers in the gallery, Elias looked like a man defeated before he had even started. They saw the fraying cuffs of his shirt, they saw the way his shoulders slumped under the weight of the moment. They saw an old man trying to hold on to a dying piece of land, an anachronism in a world moving toward progress and pavement. They didn't see the stack of papers inside his briefcase. Documents that had been buried in the local archives for nearly a century. They didn't see the quiet, burning resolve in his eyes, a resolve that had been forged in the crucible of a decade-long wait for this exact morning. The judge entered, a stern woman with spectacles perched on the tip of her nose, and the room snapped to attention. Miller stood up, his movements fluid and rehearsed, and offered a charismatic, winning smile to the bench. He was playing the part of the civic hero, the man who brought order and infrastructure to a sleepy, backward town. He was the future, Elias was the past. The courtroom was a stage, and the sheriff had spent years perfecting his performance. He looked at Elias once more before sitting down, his lip curling in a smirk that said, "I've already won." Elias remained seated for a moment longer than he should have, his fingers drumming a rhythmic beat against the table. Thump. 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 It was the heartbeat of the land he had farmed since he was a boy, the same land his father had farmed before him. He remembered the smell of the soil after a spring rain, the way the light hit the rolling hills during the golden hour, and the way the taxes had been paid on time, every single year, without fail, since the deed was signed in 1924. Sheriff Miller thought this was about a highway. He thought this was about a budget. He hadn't bothered to check the title history, because why would a man like Miller check the work of a farmer? The court clerk began reading the charges, the droning cadence of the legal speak washing over the room like a tide. Elias didn't listen to the words, he knew them by heart. He listened to the silence that followed, the weight of the atmosphere. He knew that the moment he stood up, he would be painting a target on his own back. He would be challenging the most powerful man in the county, a man who held the keys to the local law and the ears of the county commissioners. But as he looked at the sheriff's profile, the sharp line of his jaw and the arrogant set of his head, Elias felt a strange, cold clarity. He stood up. The movement was slow, deliberate. He walked toward the witness stand with the gait of a man who was walking into his own fields, not into a lion's den. As he passed the sheriff's table, Miller didn't even look at him. He was checking his watch, clearly bored by the prospect of another 10 minutes spent listening to this old man's rambling defense. Miller let out another low laugh, a sharp, nasal sound that pierced the solemnity of the room. He whispered to his lawyer, "This will be over by lunch." Elias stopped. He didn't turn around. He simply paused for a heartbeat, his head bowed, his hands gripping the wood of the witness stand. The court was waiting. The bailiff was watching him with a mixture of pity and impatience. The sheriff was leaning back, smug and comfortable. And then, Elias Thorne looked up. His eyes, clear and piercing, found the sheriff's gaze. For a second, just one, the arrogance in the room flickered. It wasn't fear yet, it was confusion. Why wasn't the old man trembling? Why was he looking at the sheriff with something that resembled pity? The judge tapped her gavel. "Mr. Thorne, please take your seat." Elias nodded, his face settling into a mask of professional calm. "Yes, Your Honor." He climbed into the chair, the wood creaking beneath him. He placed his briefcase on his lap. He didn't pull out the documents yet. He waited. He let the silence stretch. He let the sheriff's smirk falter just a fraction. He knew that the key to a victory like this wasn't shouting, and it wasn't pleading. It was timing. It was the slow, methodical dismantling of a lie, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but the truth, cold and unvarnished. The courtroom grew uncomfortably still. It was the kind of silence that usually preceded a storm, the heavy, static-charged air that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up. Sheriff Miller, sensing the shift, cleared his throat and shifted in his seat. The smirk that had adorned his face only moments ago felt suddenly ill-fitting, like a mask that had begun to slide. He leaned over to his counsel, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that carried just far enough to reach the front row. "The old man is stalling," he muttered, though his eyes remained locked on Elias with a flickering, uncharacteristic intensity. Elias, oblivious to the side conversations, carefully unlatched his briefcase. The metallic click-clack of the lock sounded like gunshots in the quiet room. He withdrew a single, yellowed envelope, its edges frayed and softened by decades of handling. It wasn't a modern legal document, it was a relic, something that looked like it belonged in a museum display rather than a modern court of law. He laid it flat on a wooden surface in front of him, smoothing it out with his thumb as if he were ironing a cloth. "Mr. Thorne," the judge said, her tone softening slightly, reflecting the bewilderment of the gallery. "You are here to contest the seizure of your property for the county bypass project. Do you have evidence that contradicts the state's eminent domain filings?" Elias looked at the judge, then back at the sheriff. He spoke, and his voice was no longer the wavering, hesitant whisper of an intimidated senior. It was steady, resonant, and carried a rhythmic cadence that commanded attention. "Your Honor, the sheriff claims this land is vital for the progress of this county. He claims that the original deeds have been superseded by modern zoning laws and that my family's claim is merely a sentimental obstruction to the public good." Miller let out a sharp, incredulous huff, shaking his head. "Your Honor, this is a waste of the court's time. He's holding a piece of paper from the Depression era. It has zero bearing on the current municipal master plan." Elias turned his head slowly to look at Miller. He didn't blink. "It isn't just a piece of paper, Sheriff. It's a promise. A promise made to my grandfather by the founders of this very county, the ones who actually built this town before you arrived to renovate it with other people's money." The courtroom murmured. A few people in the gallery leaned forward, their interest piqued by the sudden injection of real conflict. The sheriff's face darkened, a flush of irritation creeping up his neck. He stood up, his chair scraping harshly against the linoleum. "Your Honor, I object. The witness is attempting to emotionalize a purely administrative matter. I ask that you direct him to present relevant evidence or conclude his testimony." The judge held up a hand, silencing him. "Sit down, Sheriff. Mr. Thorne, please continue. But be advised, you must remain on topic." Elias nodded, his gaze returning to the envelope. "The topic, Your Honor, is the legitimacy of the sheriff's authority over my land. He believes that because he carries a badge and holds the favor of the Planning Commission, he is immune to the history of this place. He laughs at me because he thinks I am weak. He laughs because he thinks I have no friends in high places, no lawyers, and no voice." "I laugh," Miller interrupted, his voice booming with forced confidence, "because the law is on my side, Mr. Thorne. You're an old man living in a fantasy world. You think your little envelope protects you from the realities of the 21st century. It's laughable." Elias didn't respond to the jab. Instead, he pulled a small, worn photograph from the envelope. It showed a group of men standing in front of a sprawling ranch house, a house that no longer existed, but whose foundations were buried deep beneath the earth of his property. "My grandfather," Elias said, pointing to a man in the center. "He didn't just own the land, Sheriff. He was the one who drafted the original covenant for the township. He was the one who ensured that this area would remain protected, regardless of who came along later, waving a badge and a bulldozer. The sheriff's lawyer stood up, his face pale. He leaned over, whispering frantically to Miller. The sheriff ignored him, his eyes now narrowed, searching the document in Elias's hands. He sensed that something had changed. The atmosphere in the room had shifted from one of boredom to one of impending discovery. The air felt thinner, sharper. Miller started to reach for his own phone, perhaps to call the county legal office, but his hand hesitated. He knew, deep down, that something was fundamentally wrong with his case, and the realization hit him like a physical blow to the stomach. Elias continued, his voice growing stronger. You see, Sheriff, you were so eager to push this project through that you neglected the most basic step of any land seizure, a thorough title search. You relied on the computer records, on the digital maps, on the quick-fix zoning updates. You never went to the basement of the old archive building. You never looked for the physical files. Miller's face went rigid. His hand, resting on the back of his chair, gripped the wood so tightly his knuckles turned white. He wasn't laughing anymore. He was staring at the envelope with a look of dawning, horrified comprehension. He had assumed Elias was just another stubborn, uneducated farmer, an easy target. He hadn't considered the possibility that this old fool had spent the last 2 years systematically dismantling every legal argument the county could possibly raise. I didn't come here to plead for my land, Elias said, his voice quiet, echoing off the high ceilings. I came here to show you that you aren't the one in control here. You never were. The judge leaned forward, her interest fully captured now. She peered at the documents, her face unreadable. The room was deathly silent. Everyone was waiting for the next word, for the next reveal. They knew now that this wasn't going to be a simple defeat for the farmer. The power dynamic in the room had shifted, inverted entirely, and for the first time in his career, Sheriff Miller realized he was in way over his head. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. It was a vacuum, pulling the breath out of the lungs of everyone present. Elias didn't rush. He let the silence hang, letting it work on the sheriff like acid on metal. Miller was no longer looking at his phone, he was staring at the envelope in Elias's hands as if it were a ticking bomb. His confidence had evaporated, replaced by a twitching uncertainty that made him look smaller, less substantial than he had just 5 minutes ago. Elias slowly opened the envelope and produced a document that had clearly been preserved with extreme care. It was a heavy, vellum-like parchment, thick and cream-colored, with a wax seal that still bore the faint, embossed imprint of the state's original territorial insignia. Even from the gallery, you could see the weight of history hanging off the edges of that paper. Your Honor, Elias began, his voice calm, this is a deed of permanent covenant, filed in the state archives on June 14, 1926. It is not just a record of ownership. It is a binding legal directive regarding the usage of this specific plot. Miller finally spoke, his voice cracking slightly before he regained his composure. That is irrelevant, Your Honor. The state's right to eminent domain overrides private agreements. Everyone knows that. This is a desperate attempt to drag the court through ancient history to avoid a necessary public works project. The judge didn't look at the sheriff. Her eyes were fixed on the document in Elias's hands. She motioned for the bailiff to bring it to her. As the bailiff carefully took the document, handling it as if it were a holy relic, the tension in the room reached a fever pitch. Miller's lawyer was now frantically flipping through a digital tablet, his fingers flying across the screen, his face growing paler with every swipe. He looked up at Miller, his expression one of pure, unadulterated dread. He shook his head, a subtle motion that signaled total catastrophe. The sheriff noticed the gesture. He leaned over, his voice a frantic hiss. What are you doing? Find the loophole. Find the override. The lawyer whispered back, there isn't one, Sheriff. If this document is authentic, it's a protected historical landmark agreement. It doesn't just protect the land, it prevents any government entity from modifying the topography or structure of the area for a period of 100 years. The sheriff's face turned an ashen gray. 100 years? That's impossible. No such thing exists. It exists, the lawyer replied, his voice trembling. And look at the date, Sheriff. Today is the exact 100th anniversary of the filing. The realization hit the room like a physical shockwave. The laughter that had defined the beginning of the hearing suddenly felt like a ghost, a haunting reminder of the sheriff's hubris. Miller looked at Elias, and for the first time, he saw the man not as a farmer, but as a strategist. Elias hadn't been fighting for his land today, he had been waiting for this precise moment for his entire life. The entire legal battle, the court summons, the public hearings, it had all been a game of patience, a trap set a century ago by a man who had the foresight to see that greed would eventually come knocking at his descendants' door. Elias watched the sheriff's reaction with a detached, serene interest. He wasn't gloating. He wasn't filled with anger. He felt only the satisfaction of a debt being settled. He looked at the judge, who was now scanning the document with a pair of reading glasses, her eyebrows rising higher with every paragraph she finished. "Mr. Thorne," the judge said, her voice unusually hushed. "This document appears to be a genuine, registered covenant signed by the territorial governor and your grandfather. It contains a reverter clause that effectively strips the county of any claim to the property if they attempt to breach the covenant within the 100-year window." "That is correct, Your Honor," Elias replied, his voice steady. "And as of this morning, we are within that window. The sheriff's planned demolition of the northern embankment, a project he has already spent thousands of taxpayer dollars to prepare, constitutes a direct violation of this legally binding agreement." The room erupted into a low buzz of whispers. The gallery, which had been silent before, was now alive with the sound of people realizing that they had just witnessed a historic turn of events. A few people even stood up to get a better look at the document. The sheriff sat frozen in his chair, his hands gripping the table so hard his nails were digging into the wood. He was staring straight ahead, his eyes unseeing, his mind clearly racing through the consequences. He had staked his reputation, his campaign, and his career on this bypass project. He had promised his donors, his friends in the construction industry, and the voters that this highway would be built. Now, he was looking at a total, public, and humiliating defeat at the hands of the man he had spent the last hour mocking. He looked at the gallery and saw a reporter from the local newspaper scribbling furiously in a notepad. He knew that by tomorrow, the headlines wouldn't be about the highway's progress. They would be about the sheriff's incompetence. They would be about the bold farmer, who had outwitted the entire county administration. Elias, for his part, kept his eyes on the judge. He knew the legal battle wasn't over, but the momentum had shifted permanently. He had presented the truth, and he had done it in a way that left no room for interpretation. The sheriff had tried to play a game of power, and he had failed to understand that real power isn't in a badge, it's in the truth. "Sheriff Miller," the judge said, her voice sharp. "Do you have any rebuttal to this evidence?" Miller stood up, his legs feeling like lead. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The arrogance that had fueled him for years, the sense of invincibility that came with the office, had completely deserted him. He looked at Elias, the man in the frayed, decades-old suit, and realized that the farmer had won. Sheriff Miller felt the floor beneath him tilt, a dizzying sensation of vertigo that had nothing to do with the room and everything to do with the shattering of his carefully constructed reality. He stood before the bench, his uniform, once a symbol of unyielding authority, now looking like a hollow shell. The silence in the room had shifted from expectation to judgment. He could feel the eyes of every person in the gallery, the shopkeepers, the retired teachers, the local reporters, all of them processing the truth. The man they had trusted to enforce the law had been fundamentally ignorant of it. He finally found his voice, though it sounded foreign, brittle and thin. "Your Honor, this is a trap." He waited. He sat on this information, allowed us to spend millions in public funds, just to spring this on us at the 11th hour. This is bad faith litigation. His attempt to regain the offensive fell flat. It wasn't a roar, it was a whimper, the frantic reaction of a cornered animal realizing the exit was permanently sealed. Elias remained on the stand, his expression unchanging. He didn't interrupt. He didn't mock. He simply waited for the sheriff to finish his desperate, flailing accusation. When Miller finally ran out of words, Elias looked at the judge and spoke, his voice carrying an almost terrifying level of clarity. "Your Honor, the sheriff speaks of public funds. I speak of public trust. The records of this land were never secret. They were in the county clerk's basement, stored in the same file cabinets that the sheriff's own developers used to conduct their due diligence for the highway project. The only difference is that they were looking for a way to steal the land, while I was looking for the truth. He turned his gaze toward the sheriff. The transformation in Miller's face was total. The color had drained from his skin, leaving him a ghastly, translucent pale. It was as if the blood had simply decided to abandon his extremities, retreating into a heart that was now hammering against his ribs in sheer, unadulterated panic. The sheriff wasn't just losing a case, he was seeing the blueprints of his own ruin being laid out on the mahogany surface of the judge's bench. The judge glanced down at the document, then back up at Miller. Sheriff, is it true that your office's due diligence included a search of the 1920-era territorial archives? Miller hesitated. Every second of silence felt like a minute. We utilized the digital database, Your Honor. The state's official repository. And did you, the judge continued, her voice cold as steel, verify the status of the original, non-digitized covenants, as is required for any land seizure involving historical territory? Miller swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing with effort. I relied on my team, Your Honor. We have been moving at the speed the county demanded. The speed you demanded, Elias interjected, his voice quiet but sharp enough to slice through the excuses. You were so eager to put your name on a highway sign that you didn't care whose lives you trampled to get it done. You treated the law like a nuisance, and you treated me like a ghost. A murmur broke out in the gallery, a collective realization of the sheriff's negligence. The revelation was not just about the land, it was about the why. It was the hubris that had blinded him. He had viewed the farmer as an obstacle to be cleared, not a person with rights. And in that arrogance, he had failed to perform the most basic duties of his office. Miller leaned heavily on the table, his knees buckling slightly. He reached for a glass of water, his hand shaking so violently that the ice rattled against the crystal. The sound was amplified, a sharp, crystalline intrusion into the heavy air. He looked toward his lawyer, but the man had already turned away, frantically packing his briefcase as if trying to physically distance himself from the disaster unfolding in real time. Your Honor, Elias said, I don't seek damages. I don't seek to bankrupt the county. I only seek the enforcement of the law. The law that was written long before this road was conceived, and the law that should remain after the sheriff's ambitions have cooled. The judge nodded slowly, taking in the scene. She looked at the sheriff, who now looked like a ghost of the man who had walked in that morning. The pale moment had arrived, not because of a sudden threat of violence, but because of the cold, hard reality of professional and personal humiliation. He had been exposed, not just as a man who made a mistake, but as a man who had abused the immense power of his office to satisfy his own vanity. Miller slumped back into his chair. He didn't look at the judge. He didn't look at his lawyer. He stared at his own hands, the hands that had signed the demolition orders, the hands that had pointed toward the farmer's property as if it were a toy for his amusement. He realized, with a sickening clarity, that the career he had spent 20 years building was now hanging by a thread that this old farmer had just pulled. The courtroom was no longer a place of legal argument, it was a theater of consequence. The sheriff's laughter from earlier in the morning now sounded like the dying echo of a regime that had forgotten who it was meant to serve. And for the first time in his life, Elias Thorne didn't feel like a victim. He felt like the only person in the room who had actually stood up for something that mattered. The final minutes of the hearing passed with a surreal, dreamlike quality. The judge, her expression unyielding, began the process of formally dismissing the county's claim. She spoke of gross administrative negligence and the paramount importance of historical covenants. Every word she uttered was like a nail in the coffin of the sheriff's reputation. The courtroom reporter, sensing the magnitude of the moment, typed furiously, the rhythmic clacking of the keys serving as the soundtrack to a political implosion. Sheriff Miller didn't fight it. He couldn't. He sat slumped in his chair, a man hollowed out by the sudden collapse of his own facade. He stared at the floor, refusing to meet the eyes of the spectators who were already pulling out their phones to broadcast the news. The humiliation was total. The lawman had been rendered powerless by the very law he claimed to embody. As the gavel fell, a final, sharp report that echoed through the chamber, it sounded like the closing of a door on the sheriff's tenure. Elias, however, did not stand up immediately. He remained in the witness box for a long moment, allowing the weight of the moment to settle. He looked across the aisle at Miller. There was no hatred in his gaze, no spite, and no victory dance. There was only a profound, weary sadness. He had known, from the very beginning, that this outcome would destroy the sheriff's career, and while he had fought for his land, he had never truly wanted to witness the wreckage of another human being. "Mr. Thorne," the judge said, her voice softer than it had been all morning. "The court recognizes your right to the property and affirms the validity of the covenant. The injunction is permanent. The county has no further legal standing to pursue this development." "Thank you, Your Honor," Elias replied, his voice still steady. He stood up, gathered his weathered briefcase, and moved toward the exit. As he walked past the defense table, he didn't stop, but he did slow down just enough for his shadow to fall across the sheriff's desk. Miller didn't look up, but his shoulders visibly stiffened. The scene outside the courthouse was a spectacle. Reporters were waiting on the steps, their cameras flashing, their microphones extended like eager birds of prey. The story of the farmer who outwitted the sheriff was already beginning to spread, a modern-day David and Goliath tale that was tailor-made for the news cycle. As Elias emerged into the bright, unfiltered sunlight, the crowd surged forward. They wanted a statement, a soundbite, a reaction. Elias held up a hand, and the clamor died down instantly. He looked at the cameras, but he seemed to be looking through them, toward the rolling hills in the distance that were now, finally, safe. "I didn't do this to win a fight," he told the crowd, his voice carrying clearly on the wind. "I did this because when you build a foundation, you have to make sure it's on solid ground. This town was built on promises, promises of fairness, of history, and of respect." The sheriff forgot that. He thought he could move the earth without knowing what was buried beneath it. But the land has a memory, and it doesn't care about badges or highways. He turned and began the long walk to his truck. He didn't look back. He left the chaos of the courthouse behind, leaving the sheriff to answer the questions of a public that now saw him for exactly what he was, a man who had reached too far, too fast, and had tripped over his own pride. The aftermath was swifter than anyone expected. By the next morning, the local papers were in full circulation, the headline screaming, "The land that refused to yield, Sheriff Miller's costly defeat." Public outrage wasn't just about the failed project, it was about the money wasted, the arrogance displayed, and the blatant disrespect for a member of the community. Within a week, the county commissioners had launched an official inquiry into the sheriff's office. Within a month, he had announced his early retirement, citing health and family reasons. Elias returned to his farm as if nothing had happened. He continued to plow the rows, to tend to the soil, and to watch the seasons change. But the town had changed. People now looked at that stretch of land with a new kind of reverence. It wasn't just a plot of dirt, it was a symbol of resilience. It was a reminder that no matter how loud the authorities might shout, or how much power they might wield, the truth has a way of rising to the surface when the time is right. The highway bypass project was eventually moved, redirected through a barren stretch of state-owned wasteland where it belonged. The sheriff's legacy, once marked by ambition and aggression, was now defined by that one, critical mistake, the moment he decided that an old farmer didn't matter. As for Elias, he spent his evenings on his porch, looking out over the 3 acres that had cost him so much time and energy to defend. He often thought of the sheriff, not with anger, but with a strange sense of clarity. The man had been a victim of his own time, a time that valued speed over substance, and image over integrity. Elias had survived because he had patience. He had survived because he knew that the loudest voice in the room isn't always the one that tells the truth. In the end, the farmer didn't just save his home. He taught the town a lesson that would be remembered for generations. He proved that even in a world that seems to be moving too fast to care, there is still power in the soil, there is still strength in the truth, and there is still justice for those who are willing to wait for it. The sheriff had learned that the hard way, in a cold, silent room, when he finally realized that the old man in the frayed suit had been holding the winning hand all along.